Sometimes when reading the Gospels, it's hard to imagine how clueless and blind Jesus' disciples were.
I don't get it.
But we don't have to imagine it. It's spelled out pretty clearly for us. Welcome back to the Bible Paladin as we continue to read Mark's Gospel. And today we'll be hearing how Jesus predicts his passion and death for the third time. And once again, how his disciples fail to understand him.
I don't get it.
But maybe some of them actually do understand Jesus more than we give them credit for. But after Jesus teaches them a lesson, we'll be hearing a beautiful story about compassion that we might also learn something from. So we ask for the guidance and wisdom of the Holy Spirit as we read from the Gospel. They were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. "We are going up to Jerusalem," he said, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise." Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink, and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared." When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." By now, we should be more familiar with these passion, death, and resurrection predictions, each one with a little bit more details, and perhaps the disciples are as well. Remember, after the first one, Jesus took Peter, James, and John up the mountain and revealed his glory. Maybe James and John are starting to get the message that Jesus will rise triumphant as they try to understand what it means to be raised on the third day. They know that they already have this privileged place among the disciples. So if Jesus is the Messiah, he will usher in his kingdom at some point, and they want to know their place in that. It is most likely that they are thinking of an earthly kingdom, even related to Jesus' recent promise that they will receive the blessings of family and property 100-fold based on what they had given up to follow him. They are, after all, on their way to Jerusalem, where it is assumed that Jesus is going to do whatever it is that the Messiah is supposed to do. And so they asked him to sit at his right and his left.
Hold it, Grandpa. You read that wrong.
Did I? Well, you might remember that it was the mother of James and John who made this request. And you would be right if we were reading Matthew's gospel. But Mark makes no mention of her. So how do we reconcile this difference? Well, perhaps it was simply their mother was behind the request, just like the mother of Jacob was. Maybe Matthew knew some details that Mark didn't. Or Matthew wanted to make the apostles look a bit less ambitious. Well, we don't know. But ultimately, it doesn't change the theological significance of this conversation. And once again, Jesus uses it to teach the disciples about humility and service. At first, Jesus seems to take the request at face value. Okay, you want to share in my glory? Can you share in my suffering? Can you share in my rejection? Can you atone for the sins of all mankind? Okay, so he doesn't exactly say that, but the meaning may not be too far off. And early Christians who heard this would certainly be hearing sacramental language as he talks about the cup and he talks about being baptized. So they would connect this to the Eucharist and to baptism. But James and John may have heard something completely different. The image of drinking from the cup, as seen in the Old Testament and other Hebrew writings, could refer to blessing, but more often pointed to suffering or divine wrath. Baptism, in the most literal sense, would mean to be submerged in water, but in this context could even mean drunkenness, which would also bring up negative connotations, such as losing all sense of oneself. And understanding this metaphor, it is really asking if they are able to endure the suffering and the calamity that Jesus is about to undergo. Based on this reading, it has been suggested that Jesus is inferring that he will drink the cup of God's wrath on behalf of his people. And so in the way in which he says it, the expected answer from the disciples would be, no, we cannot. I mean, this is something that would be reserved for the Messiah. And yet, they answer in the affirmative. I can just see Jesus sighing and looking at them with love and compassion when he responds. What if they were not ready to hear about their own fate? But Jesus does assure him that they will drink the cup. They too will suffer. So perhaps they did understand what Jesus was saying earlier when he said, in order to gain life, you must be willing to lose your life. James and John are willing to follow Jesus, even to his death, even to their deaths. Because of this, Jesus does not outright deny the request. He simply says that it is not for him to give. This honor has already been preordained. Of course, the other apostles are not happy when they intercept this conversation. All they see are the sons of thunder vying for places of honor. So Jesus has to quickly turn this conversation around and use it as another opportunity to talk about what leadership means for the apostles.
Let's go over it again. We've been over it again.
They are to be servant leaders. And so he makes a comparison not to Jewish leadership, but instead to how the authority of the Gentiles is seen. This is particularly striking and insulting because the clearest view of this for his disciples is how the Romans have been exercising authority over their nation. In fact, they are the ones the Messiah is supposed to overthrow, and Jesus is telling his disciples that they are behaving no better than the Romans. In this time, when talking about the level of service and sacrifice that they must exercise, he uses not only the word for service, as we saw before, diakonos, but also doulos, which means slave. They are to give up their very freedom in service to one another and to the gospel. 3 times Jesus has predicted his death and resurrection, and 3 times he has talked about the importance of service and how the disciples must deny themselves in order to follow him. And this is a common literary device and as seen throughout the gospel. When something is repeated 3 times, it means that it is a very significant and important teaching. Before we continue, just a quick advertisement for a great Bible resource. To continue your own Bible study, I really recommend Logos Bible software. Not only does it make it easy to read and cross-reference in the Bible, but also they have numerous commentaries, books, and articles to enhance your Bible study. Order Logos from the link below, and you'll also be supporting this channel. While this next miracle story may seem a bit unrelated, notice how Jesus models the behavior that he expects from his apostles. There's also the connection between physical and spiritual blindness. So let us continue reading. Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. As we heard at the beginning of the chapter, they are on their way to Jerusalem. And as we will hear later, they will be going to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of Passover. So there would be a lot of people traveling on the road at this time. Jericho is fairly close to Jerusalem, so many would be stopping there to rest or lodge during their pilgrimage for the festival. As was custom in many large cities, the beggars would sit right outside the city gates, hoping to grab the attention of anyone entering or leaving the city. And since Jesus was traveling, there would have already been a great crowd that was around him as they left the city on their way up to Jerusalem. Now we hear about Bartimaeus. And Mark explains to his Greek audience the Hebrew naming convention, for Bartimaeus literally means the son of Timaeus. And so either the blind man or Timaeus himself may have been known to the early Christian community.
There are some who call me Tim.
Let's consider his call out to Jesus. For someone who is blind, he already seems to see better than many of the apostles. For when Jesus comes by, he shouts out, "Son of David, have pity on me." Son of David was a messianic title. So this man already had some knowledge and faith in who Jesus was and what he could do. And while the 12 are fighting over who deserves titles of honor and positions of glory, he recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. And ultimately, he just wants to see, to reintegrate into society and not have to sit outside the city and beg. Now, the crowds with Jesus wanted nothing to do with this blind man, and in fact tried to prevent him from coming to Jesus. They were literally rebuking him. And remember what Jesus said about acceptance and service? And so Jesus now models what he's been telling his disciples and how he approaches Bartimaeus. First, Jesus stops and says, "Call him." Jesus, while maintaining his example as a servant, is still the leader and has his disciples go and summon the man. And knowing what is about to happen, yes, the apostles are starting to catch on more quickly now, they go down and tell Bartimaeus to cheer up because they can see what is about to happen. And Bartimaeus realizes it too because he jumps up and throws off his cloak. Knowing what is about to happen, knowing that he is going to get a new life, he throws off his old one. And the dialogue that follows is really beautiful. Working with patient satisfaction at a faith-based hospital, I've often used this passage to talk about how our caregivers are to treat patients with compassion and dignity. Because Jesus asks the man, "What do you want me to do for you?" He does not assume anything about him. And so very often it is so easy just to assume what a person wants or needs. But instead, Jesus shows the dignity and respect of this individual and asks Timaeus, "What do you want from me? What do you want me to do for you?" He does not label him. He simply offers his service. Bartimaeus responds simply, "Rabbi, I want to see." Already he identifies himself as a student because he calls Jesus rabbi or teacher. He not only wants to see physically, but he wants to see spiritually. He wants to learn at the feet of his new master and to know what is it that he is really offering. And this becomes more evident when we see what happens next. Jesus tells him, "Go, your faith has healed you." As Bartimaeus gains his sight, he is given a choice. Jesus gives him permission to go. He no longer has to sit by the side of the road and beg. He can experience life. He can get a job. He can maybe even start a family. And yet, what does he do? It says that he follows Jesus along the road. The Greek phrase is te hodo, which can also be translated as the way, which is a common phrase in Acts of the Apostles, which referred to Christians as followers of the way. But in this context, as Jesus is leaving Jericho, he is on his way up to Jerusalem. And Jesus has just told his disciples for the third time that he is going to have to suffer and die. And Jerusalem is where this will all take place. Bartimaeus is doing what Jesus has been asking his followers to do. Take up your cross and follow me. And did you notice for the first time after Jesus heals someone, he does not tell him to be quiet? This blind man who can now see is going to help teach others to see. He becomes a disciple. How are these stories relevant for us today? The placement of this miracle is very significant because it is the last miracle of Jesus in Mark's gospel, unless you include the one where Jesus kills a tree. But we'll get to that next time.
What did you say?
Seriously. But from here on out, we'll be focusing on Jesus' teaching in Jerusalem and the events that will lead up to his passion, death, and resurrection. In many ways, Bartimaeus represents Jesus' ministry and, more importantly, the Christian response to it, particularly because he is not told to be silent about it. When first hearing the message of the gospel, it's easy to be confused, to not understand, or simply to dismiss it. We might be like the crowds. I just came for the miracles, but changing my life sounds like work. Or like the scribes and Pharisees. I grew up with certain beliefs, and I'm not about to change them now. Or like the Gentiles. Who is this guy, and why should I even care about what he has to say? Or like the rich young man who was unwilling to part with his wealth. Then there are those who decide to follow, the crowds that are still trying to discern his teachings. The women brave enough to touch his cloak, or argue for the sake of her child, the sinner who wants another chance, or the fisherman who seeks the Messiah. Bartimaeus is like the apostles once they are able to shed their ambition and pride. Once they realize that without Jesus, they are just sitting by the side of the road in the mud and begging. Once that has been stripped away, once they start arguing about who is the greatest or who will have seats of honor, then they might be able to actually see. Jesus has been asking his followers, asking us in these last few chapters, what are you willing to give up in order to follow me? What do you think it is that actually keeps you in darkness? Maybe you think that you're not worthy, or you've already screwed up too badly that it's too late for you. Sorry, not an excuse. Bartimaeus would have been told his whole life that he was a sinner, because who else but a sinner would be blind? At least that was the common sentiment back then. But no, when Bartimaeus heard about Jesus, he jumped up and wanted to see what Jesus could offer him. And when touched by the Lord, he made a choice to follow him. Now that he could see, he could have experienced so much of life that he had missed out on, and yet he chooses to follow Jesus. And I think that's the challenge of the gospel, because once we've encountered Jesus, once we have begun to believe, the appropriate response is to follow him. And we may not understand completely, but Jesus isn't slowing down. He's leading us somewhere. And in this story, that somewhere is leading to Jerusalem. The invitation is the cross. While it may not sound appealing, the reward is quite beyond our imagination. So if you want to find out more about that, well, let's continue down this home stretch to see where it will take us. I can't wait to continue this journey with you. Thank you so much for joining me. And as always, if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, comment, just so we can get more engagement with this channel and get it out to more people. So next time we are going to be entering into Jerusalem with Jesus and his triumphant entry. And there's some great stories that go along with this. And so until next time, keep searching, and God bless.